welcome to The Crafted Spoon, where I discuss pursuing coziness whilst living in a capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy in need of toppling. If you're a returning viewer, it is so wonderful to see you again, and if you're a new viewer, I'm really glad that you found your way to my little corner of the internet. If you enjoy people deep diving into their hobbies, then you are in the right place. I'm Eva, a chronically ill, endlessly curious, disabled knitter and bookworm who uses she, her pronouns. I live within sight of Lake Ontario with my partner Joel and an assortment of pets. We live on the homeland of the Haudenosaunee, specifically that of the Onondaga, known to settlers as the Seneca, and this land became settler land after a sustained ethnic cleansing campaign carried out by the Europeans, including George Washington, who during the Revolutionary War ordered the raising of villages and winter food supplies throughout this area in an attempt to clear the land. Nevertheless, the Haudenosaunee Nation continues to exist, and they are full of marvelous things, including the Mohawk Ironworkers. The Mohawk are another nation within the Confederacy, and starting in the late 19th century, they became known for their skills at doing ironwork. They started with riveting on a bridge, and then when Manhattan began building a lot of skyscrapers in the 1920s, they came down and worked on the skyscrapers. Despite an attempt by U.S. immigration to deport them back to Canada, the courts ruled that since they are a nation within a nation, the Haudenosaunee and Mohawk nations, they had every right to stay there. And to this day, about 10% of the ironworkers in Manhattan are Mohawk. And I just think that that's really incredible. Today, I will be talking about my knitting. It's not a book podcast. I did miss my book podcast last week. My chronic illnesses flared, and I was in too much pain to sit in front of the computer. So hopefully I can talk more about books next week. But for now, I'll be talking about my works in progress, my finished objects. I have a fiber arts and literature passage to share with you. I will be discussing the change to my podcast's name, if you notice that in the introduction. And finally, I'll be talking a little bit about swatches. So let's get started. I have two works in progress to show you, one that you've seen before and one that is just the beginning of a work in progress. But I thought it would be nice to kind of trace the development of a sweater from the beginning to the end. So the first step, I have started the first sleeve of my Fabergé cardigan. And Nessie, lay down. Lay down. Oh, good girl. Sorry about that. So I've started the first sleeve of my Fabergé cardigan, and I have about 3 inches left to go. I'm going to make this a 3/4 length sleeve cardigan, so I'm aiming for 12.5 inches or 31 centimeters. And I almost never have problems knitting sleeves for sweaters. Sleeve island is not really a concept that has ever been an issue for me before. I enjoy knitting socks, and I think of sleeves as socks fit longer. But the sleeves for this sweater, I am definitely on sleeve island. I finally had to tell myself that I'm not allowed to cast on any more socks or hats until I get these sleeves knit. And what's funny is usually I do set-in sleeves for sweaters, but this sweater I'm going to do is a seamless yoke. So I actually have less sleeve knitting to do than usual. I think that there might be a couple reasons why I am not enjoying knitting this sleeve as much. First of all, I knit the body flat versus in the round, and then the sleeve I'm knitting in the round just so that I can get a continual pattern on the slip stitch. I'll talk about this in a minute. And whenever there's any kind of striping or things like that in the round, I tend to get annoyed by the yarn management. But I've worked out a couple systems. When I'm not using the cream yarn, I just put it in through the sleeve, and then I don't have to worry about it. And when I'm not using the pink yarn, which is a much larger ball because I just balled up all my skeins together, I just make sure that I set it a certain direction, and then the yarns don't twist. So I've sorted out that. The other thing it might be is my double-pointed needles are wooden, whereas the rest of the body I knit on metal needles. And usually I prefer wooden needles. I love how they look, I love how they're kind of warm and that kind of thing, but I think that the extra slip is nice in the case of these slip stitches. So I don't know. There's a couple reasons why the sleeves are not my favorite part of this sweater to knit, but I will be done with that soon, and then knitting the seamless yoke. I'm excited to see how that's going to go, and I'll be back on the metal circular needles. I was going to tell you about this cuff. So to match the sweater body, I did corrugated rib cuff. So this is stranded color work, even though this is not. All right, do you want up in my lap? Come up, Ness. You want to say hi? What she really wants to do is get all this stuff on my desk, but oh, I probably shouldn't be showing you Joel's phone number. This is Nessie. Here, should we take this harness off? No, you're good. And I started to do the corrugated rib in the round, and it just, corrugated rib already feels a little fiddly to me, and then adding in all of the double pointed needles, it was just too much. So I ripped it back, and I instead knit this flat, and I just cast on 2 extra stitches so that I can seam it up. And that was just much more soothing for me. I actually almost find corrugated rib easier to knit on the wrong side than the right side. I don't know, something about the rhythm for it. And of course, in this particular corrugated rib, I'm purling more than I'm knitting, so that might have something to do with it. There we go. But yeah, so like I said, I would have considered knitting the whole sleeve flat, except I really wanted to get a kind of continual pattern going on with the slip stitch. See how there's no real seam there. And the only way I could do that is if I knit in the round. What I ended up doing for calculating this was I measured my bicep, which was 12.5 inches when flexing. And then I decided to aim for around a 14-inch sleeve so that I would have a little bit of layering room. Then I multiplied that by my gauge, which was 8 stitches to the inch, which is what? 112 stitches. So I knew that at the bicep, I was going to have 112 stitches. And I also knew that with this pattern, I prefer to shape by needle size, not by actual increases and decreases. So then I decided how many, or I measured around here, which I can't remember how many stitches it was. But anyway, so I got that measurement. And then for the cuffs, I had done slightly fewer stitches. Instead of 8 stitches per repeat, I'd only done 6 stitches per repeat. So that means that I had 28 fewer stitches at the cuff because 8 times 14, so that's 14 repeats. 8 stitches is both my gauge per inch and the number of repeats for the pattern. That could have been confusing. My apologies. So because I want a 14-inch sleeve at the bicep, there's 14 repeats of the pattern. And it just so turned out that reducing by the 28 stitches pretty much got me to where I wanted to be on my cuff. I did go ahead and decrease from a size 3 to a size 2 because I started on size 3s and it was very loose and didn't look that great. So I went down to the size 2s when I ripped back to start knitting flat. And then I stayed on the size 2s for the first couple diamonds in the sleeve. And then I swapped to the size 3s, and I've been knitting ever since. I hope that that made sense. My apologies if it was a little disjointed. It definitely looks like sloppier than the knit flat body does, so I'm hoping that that kind of blocks out. I think it will. Let's see, is there anything else? I took notes again. Oh. So I don't actually own any straight needles, but I'm not a huge fan of knitting flat projects on a cabled needle if I can help it, because the cable part annoys me. Apparently I'm easily annoyed by things I'm knitting. So what I have instead are these little silicone things, which I got on Etsy. And I can just, so these are 6-inch double pointed needles, and I just pop one on for each of these. And then I've got short straight needles. And usually the things that I'm knitting will end up fitting on here because I'm one of those people that likes all my stitches scrunched up anyway. But yeah, so that in case you too I don't know, it might be useful for other people. Basically, before I had these, I just used some point protectors that I inherited from my great grandma. So like a eraser would work, anything that you can just kind of put in the end. And I've never had any of them move or pop off and lose my stitches that way. So if I'm knitting something that requires more space than a 6-inch needle, I actually prefer to knit it on a cabled needle anyway, because then the weight tends to sit more in my lap versus on the end of the needle, kind of harassing my wrists. I don't know why I'm so grumpy today. My apologies. I do know why. I have been having some trouble with nightmares for at least a week, so I'm a little bit sleep deprived, which makes me grumpy. On to my other work in progress, which is currently a swatch, hence why I'll be talking about swatches today. I decided that as much fun as I've had knitting small projects, I would really like to work on another large project now. So that is a swatch for a sweater. And it is the Stag Head Sweater by Nora Gahn from the Making magazine issue 2, I think, Fauna, which I was generously sent. And it's this sweater. I'm sure you've seen it if you spend time on Ravelry or Instagram, basically the online knitting community. It's by Nora Gahn, and it goes up to a 61¼ inch bust circumference, although it also recommends at least 4 inches of positive ease, so they could have done better on that. And I have loved this sweater ever since I saw it because I love knitwear with animals, as you might have noticed from my cardigan today, which is an adaptation of the Wet Wang pattern by Aunt Kingston, in case you were curious, which I adapted into a cardigan. So I actually have already knit the antler chart. I knit it as a pillow, a throw pillowcase for my father for Christmas a few years ago. But I had never wanted to knit the sweater for myself because I don't really wear wool pullovers, and it's knit with worsted weight wool yarn, and I knew that I would just overheat. Cardigans I find much easier. I use a lot of heating pads to help my pain levels. I've got one on me now. So cardigans are just much more compatible with that lifestyle. And also I have limited neck and shoulder kind of range of motion, so pulling clothes on and off can be a challenge. However, I knit my rabbit pullover out of cotton yarn. So basically it's a t-shirt last summer, and I love wearing that. And so I thought I could adapt this pattern into a t-shirt in non-wool yarn. So that's what I'm doing. And the yarn that I'm using is really, it's an interesting yarn. So I'm going to name it, even though I don't know how good Barocco is as far as general company policies, but this is a very affordable yarn, so I want to bring it up for that reason. And also it's remix, so it is made entirely out of recycled fiber, and it can be really difficult to find organic cotton yarn, and when I do, like, sometimes it's quite pricey, and so having a recycled option is really nice. Also, this is not cotton. It's a nylon, cotton, linen, silk, acrylic blend. And so it behaves more like wool yarns than the 100% cottons that I've knit with it. And you can see it's really elastic. And it comes in all these beautiful heathered colors. So I'm really hopeful that if the yarn works out for me, then I can use it to knit some various colorwork pullovers. So this is an experiment. I managed to get 3 skeins of this on D-Stash. And one of the things that's interesting about it is it's labeled a DK. It's labeled Remix Light DK. It's suggested to knit on, I think, US 5s at 22 stitches to the inch. However, it has over 400 yards and 100 grams, which is the yardage I would expect from a fingering weight yarn, which is why it's so affordable. So a sweater's quantity requires fewer skeins, and the skeins are like $12 each. So assuming that that gauge actually works, this is definitely a budget-friendly, environmentally friendly yarn. And it was actually the Aran Weight remix that I used to knit my dad's pillowcase, because it seemed like pillowcases should be able to go in the wash. So, where was I? So I knit a swatch, and I actually knit it on 2 size needles. It's this way. I started on size 5s, the recommended gauge, and then I went down to size 4s just to see how that looks, and I like that a little better. It's definitely still a bit loose, especially when I hold it up. You can kind of see lighting-wise, and I swatched in both seed stitch and stockinette. Because when I knit my dad's sweater, his pillowcase, one of the things I noticed was that the yarn looks better in seed stitch than it does in reverse stockinette, which is part of this antler chart. So I wanted to kind of compare those two things. And I still have to wash this swatch. That's the only thing I have left to do. Before I use a swatch to measure sweater gauge, I wash it the way I'm going to wash the sweater. So in this case, I'll put it in the washer. And I think the yarn band suggests flat drying, but honestly, I'll probably put it in the dryer just to see what happens, because that would simplify my life. So even if like I said, I'm leaning towards the size 4s, which I think is actually right on the band gauge. I cast on 33 stitches since the band recommended 22 stitches to 4 inches, and I like a 6-inch gauge swatch. And I'm pretty sure this is right around 6 inches. So even at the recommended gauge, it will be tighter than what the pattern calls for. The pattern calls for 18 stitches over 4 inches. And because I am going to want around a 38-inch finished bust measurement on my sweater, I should be able to just knit one of the larger sizes. So that shouldn't be too big of a deal to adjust. And I think that from what I can tell, the length, well, I'll be changing the length, but I'll get into that in a minute. Most of the lengths. The length of the arm side also varies. The yoke depth. Yeah, every size, the yoke depth is another 1/2 inch deep, which I don't think is actually good practice for sizing, because I don't think people's arm side depth increases at the same rate as their circumference does. Anyway, that is not relevant to this discussion. But because of that, I think that I can just go ahead and adapt the pattern and it'll work pretty well, as is, as far as the charts go. The other changes that I'm going to make, you can try not to flash you the whole sweater. Directions, no? Oh yeah, they do the pictures in another part. Can you tell I'm not used to knitting magazines? Here it is, okay. So it's a positive E sweater, and it gets wider at the hem, but here, because of the cables, it just, I don't know. I feel like either it needs to get much wider, like a tunic, or be more fitted. It's just not a look that I want for my particular body, basically. So I was browsing projects, and I came across Megan the Smith's project, and she knit this as a fitted. She did 1.5 inches of positive ease. She's quite small, cropped pullover. So as you know, if you've watched the podcast before, I'm a big fan of crop sweaters because I wear them over full skirts, over fit and flare dresses, and in the winter, my woolen trousers that I've thrifted are also wide-legged. So fitted on top and wider on bottom is one of my go-to silhouettes. I have broad shoulders, and I like how it looks on me. So I love her look, and she mentions, like I said, that she did 1.5 inches of positive ease instead of 4 to 6 inches. So I think that I'm going to go ahead and go with that goal, and I have a 36-inch bust, so that's why I'm aiming for 37.5 to 38 inches on the bust. And once I've washed this swatch, then that'll tell me a little more about what I need to do to make that happen. It's got set-in sleeves, which I really like. And she also mentioned that she just went directly into the antler chart on the front, or the skull chart, I should say, versus, and so that gives me a good idea for the length that I want. I will probably check my row measurements on my swatch and compare it to how many rows the front chart is, just to make sure that that's going to be a long enough sweater for me, even though I'm pretty short. I'm 5'3", which I think is 168 centimeters. I used to know that better. Maybe 163 centimeters. Anyway, yeah, it's 163 centimeters. I am long in the torso, so for me, a cropped sweater needs to be like at least 12 inches from the underarm to the hem. And with cardigans, I like them a little shorter, but I think with a pullover, I would probably err on the longer side, but I might just make the waistband longer so that I've got a more fitted middle section, which gives that kind of retro vintage look that I really like. Let's see. The other thing that I'm going to do is Megan the Smith's project still has the long sleeves, but I don't want long sleeves. I want it to be more of a t-shirt length. So I haven't decided yet if I'm going to do the sleeves just right above the elbow or if I want them to be like here. I think right above the elbow would look really cute on its own, but I think if I did it here, it would be easier to layer under some of my other hand knit cardigans in the winter. So I have not decided on that yet. I also don't have a huge amount of yarn. I have 3 skeins, which is over 1,200 yards. But if I look at how much it calls for, let's see. To have a finished measurement of 36.5 inches, it calls for 1,045 yards of worsted weight yarn at the original gauge, which is looser than mine. So I'm going to need more yardage that way. But I'm also knitting it cropped. So I'll probably knit the body first and then try it on. And I might actually knit the sleeve, do a provisional cast on, knit this part of the sleeve, try it on, and then knit a longer cuff if I decide I want to go all the way to the elbow. We'll see. I'm going to start with the body. So those were the decisions kind of that were swirling in my head as I was deciding to make this project and do the swatch, which took me about an hour, so plenty of time to daydream. The only other thing that I had in mind, and the reason why this is in seed stitch instead of stockinette, I don't know why I keep showing it to you, it's too bright, is that I've learned from experience that even though I love the look of sweaters that are covered in cables, I don't wear them that often. Cables make a fabric stiffer, and it might also be that a couple of the cabled sweaters I've knit have just been in yarn that ends up itching me. So in that case, it wasn't the cable's fault. But just the more cables you have in a garment, the less drape you're going to have, and I just like having some drape in my knitwear. I already tried to knit at a fairly firm gauge for longevity's sake, as opposed to just getting drape by sizing up on needles. So I wasn't sure if I was going to use all of the charts because Nora Gaughan's version has cables on the front, the back, and the sleeves. And I thought what I might do is do the antler on the front and then do the rest of it with the same ribbing cuffs and then just in seed stitch as opposed to doing cables anywhere else. So that's why I swatched them both. And I really do love how this yarn looks in seed stitch. It looks knobbly and textured and delicious. I also really enjoy knitting seed stitch, both flat and in the round, so it would not be an issue for me to knit a sweater's garment in seed stitch. However, then I looked more closely at the chart, which I will not show you, but I realized that, and this makes sense because Nora Gaughan is a very clever designer and she's known for her cables, but there's actually proportionally not that many cables on the sweater, especially on the backs and the sleeve panels. And there is a lot of textured knitting, but not as much, not so many cables that I think that it would make the fabric too stiff, especially in this yarn, which is the recommended gauge is definitely on the looser side. I mean, there's a ton of drape in there. So I think that I'll probably just knit it to pattern. I am still tempted to replace the reverse stockinette with seed stitch because I know it will look better. But the problem with that is if you're using reverse stockinette in order to make the cables pop, because reverse stockinette sits more backwards, further to the back, I don't know if that makes sense, but compared to stockinette stitch. Seed stitch doesn't have that same effect. So rather than it looking like the antler, the stag skull is floating on the yoke, if I switch this to seed stitch, it won't look as much like it's floating, basically. So I probably won't switch it on the front. I might on the sides, but the sleeves in the back, but I think there's very little reverse stockinette on the sleeves in the back. And really on the front, because I'll be starting here to make it cropped, it's only going to be up here. So maybe I'll switch from continental knitting to English style knitting for that section because I tend to be a tidier knitter in English, or a tidier purler, I should say. My continental purling method is the one that has you do this, the yarn, and if that made sense. And so that tends to result in a looser stitch. Wow, that was a lot of conversation about a swatch. I hope that it was useful. That's pretty much the amount of thought that I bring to all the sweaters that I knit because I really enjoy it. I certainly don't think that's the only way to create sweaters. I love style and I love wardrobe creation, and so I really love all of the details of garment knitting in a way that might be too much for some people, but for me it's just the right amount. First of all, I thought it might be nice for you to see all three of the pets. So that's this soul sleeping on the purple pillow in the corner, and then Nessie, who you saw in a close-up, is the other dog, and Moth is the cream cat who is grooming Nessie because it would be too much for them to enjoy peaceful naps without something happening. I have 3 finished objects, but only 2 to show you because I mailed one of them. So first I knit another Breakwater hat, and I really love how this turned out. So the one I showed you last episode was low contrast, and this is the same, one of the yarns is the same. It's Kente by Fully Spun, and it's this beautiful gradient, and I really wanted to knit it with a cream yarn, a simpler yarn, just to show off the gradient. So I just pulled a cream yarn from my stash, and I really love the way it moves from greens down in the ribbing through orange and then through lots of pinks. So I'm really delighted with the way this turned out, and I think you can see how fun Yellie's pattern is in the higher contrast, even though I love the low contrast version too. And I knit the larger size in the regular length, just like the first one, and it fits really nicely, although I never managed to have hat-appropriate hair on podcast day, apparently. Yeah, that's not going to happen. You'll just have to take my word for it. If you would like to hear more details about the Breakwater hat, you should watch my last episode where I talked a lot more about it. But it's a really great colorwork pattern, and I think it would be perfect for a first-time colorwork knitter. And it is going to be February's pattern giveaway. Every month I'll be giving away a pattern by a BIPOC designer. And Yellie is Filipina American. And yeah, so anyone who leaves any comments on my YouTube channel all month gets entered at the end for a drawing. And I just did the drawing for January, and I left a comment replying to the person who won. I don't have your email address though. Should have written this down. Anyway, so just check and see if I remember it was on the first episode, and your username starts with an O. And yeah, so if you would like to be entered to win this, just leave a comment. And if you don't want to be entered, that's perfectly fine. you don't have to include that in the comment. Just if your name is drawn, let me know then, and I'll just draw another person. It seems the simplest method. I then knit another hat where I used the kente as the background color and the cream as the foreground color, because I thought it would be neat to play with those kind of value swaps and show off the gradient in a different way. So I will go ahead and insert the pictures now. Because I mailed this off to Darlie, who is the generous knitter and quilter who made me this beautiful quilt, which one day I'll figure out a lighting setup so that you can see the background more easily. Anyway, in exchange for a sweater that I knit her, but I wanted to knit her a little something else as well because the quilt, oh my gosh, it's such a big project. So I knit her an Ornithorai Hat by Kyla Shia Overbay, who is Arctis Knits, and she used to have a podcast and is still on Instagram, and we're friends, and she has a botany degree, and she makes these wonderful nature-inspired knitting patterns. So I had test knit the Ornithorai Hat back when she was releasing it a couple years ago, I think. I knit a version for my friend for Christmas, and she still really likes it. And the kente, I could see that there were going to be a lot of like oranges and reds coming up, and it really reminded me of pheasants. So that's why I wanted to do a feather pattern. Now the pattern is written for DK, but my yarn was fingering weight. So I looked at the chart, and it comes in 2 sizes, and the larger size was a 20 stitch repeat. So I just did more repeats of the chart. No, a 40 stitch repeat, sorry. So I did 4 repeats of the chart. So I had 160 stitches for the main body, and that worked out really well. In order to address any possible length issues, I just knit a longer brim, and I did it in 1x1 ribbing instead of the colorwork ribbing that the pattern has, just so that if Darlie wants to turn it up to have a shorter hat, she can. I really love how it turned out. It definitely makes me want to try more of this particular pattern with like variegated and gradient yarns, or like swap out my colors and try to do homages to different types of birds. I think it would be fun. Yeah, it was a fun pattern. It worked up really quickly. I enjoyed it both times around. And even though it's not as repetitive as something like this, and there are long floats that you have to catch, so I wouldn't recommend it to a beginner colorwork knitter, I do think that once you've had a few projects under your belt, it's very doable. And there are fewer tricky floats to catch than you might expect, because most of the time where you need to catch a float, there will be a contrast color in the round below. So then it's really easy to hide that catch. Whew. One more finished object, and these are my Afshari socks. And this is a pattern by Hunter Hammerson from Silk Road Socks, which I have the first edition of. I got secondhand on eBay, but there's a new edition out. And it's all inspired by rug weaving traditions along the Silk Road. So this is the original pattern. And for my version, I copied a different Ravelry user who did fewer repeats for the cuff. So I did 2 repeats of chart A and 1 repeat of chart B, as opposed to 4 repeats of chart A and 2 of chart B. And then I just knit plain stockinette until I got to the toes. And for the toes, I added a free pattern called Miss Fox Socks. So they're a fox face. And these socks are a replacement for my first pair of fox face socks that I wore so frequently that the sole basically disintegrated and darning could no longer save them. So here they are. I really love how they turned out. For the embroidery, I had some trouble with the eyes the first time. So once again, I looked at other users' projects, and I noticed that one knitter had just done basically, I think it's called Swiss darning or duplicate stitch, one for each eye. And I thought that looked really great. So that's what I did. And then I did more elaborate noses. And I just used black yarn from my stash. I think it's a worsted weight cotton, but it was from my little, I keep my leftovers in bags according to weight. So that's where that came from. And yeah, I really love them. I made a silly reel that the volume on the music is way too loud, so I apologize to anyone on Instagram who was attacked. I didn't realize how loud it was until Joel played my reel, and I was like, whoa! But yeah, I am really excited to have fox socks to wear again. I missed wearing them. Next up, I am going to read to you. It's a short passage, and it is from Race to the Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is a middle grade fantasy novel that I'm very much enjoying. I'm about halfway through it, and it's based on Dina or Navajo traditions, and the author herself is from Navajo Nation. So they have visited Spider Woman. And, oh, here it is. Afterward, we take our dishes to the sink and wash them, putting them to the plastic rack to dry. Then I wander over to look at one of the looms. The rug in progress is a combination of browns and tans. It reminds me of the desert. Would you like me to teach you how to weave? Spider-Woman asks as she joins me. Maybe another time, I say. I kind of have a lot going on right now, what with the monster-killing duties and all. I understand, but weaving can soothe the mind as well as the soul. There is beauty and harmony in it. This one's my favorite. I brush a hand across another rug, red and black, with a white zigzag lightning pattern. So I really liked that little exchange, and I like that they're, because I do think that fiber arts are soothing to the mind and the soul. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you're looking for a kind of lighthearted adventure type story that you can read with your kids, then once again, it is Race to the Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. And I'm sure I'll talk about it more next week on my books episode. All that's left now is to talk about swatching and my name change. I think I'll talk about swatching first. So, as you saw earlier, I do swatch for sweaters, and I tend to make quite large swatches for sweaters, at least at first. When I'm deciding what needle size I want to knit with, I aim for a 6-inch, which is a 15 centimeter wide and long swatch, although I might swap up needle sizes within that. I usually try at least 2 needle sizes. And what I'm looking for in that case is the fabric that I like best, both appearance and how much it drapes, that kind of thing. So I usually start with the recommended needle, either from the pattern if I'm using one, which I'm usually not for sweaters, or the yarn band, or if there's a needle that a needle size that I usually use for whatever weight yarn it is, I'll start there. And then depending on what I think about that fabric as it's forming, I'll either go up a needle size or down a needle size to experiment a little with the swatch. Once I'm doing design type swatches where I'm either deciding between a few stitches or I'm trying to figure out how to make like the ribbing flow out into the main body, that kind of thing, then I'll do much smaller swatches. I'll show you the swatch for the Fabergé. So this is my swatch where I was basically trying to play with different ways to grow the slip stitch pattern out of the corrugated rib. And you'll see that, do I have, oh my goodness, where could I have put it? There it is. The swatch, I got close to what I did with the finished, but then I added some wraps down here that aren't on the swatch. And at that point, I knew what looked good. I knew about what I was going to do. And so I just went with it for the main body. But as you can see, this is quite a small swatch. So what I'll usually do in that case is enough stitches that I can get a feel for the main design. This design calls for an 8-stitch repeat. So it looks like I did maybe 32 stitches across. And then I just did some stockinette up here maybe I was checking gauge. I'm not sure. So I do big swatches when I'm trying to decide fabric if I've never knit with a yarn before. Also, this is out of a yarn I've knit with a lot of times. And trying to just get to know things. And then I do smaller swatches for the design aspect of knitting sweaters. I don't tend to swatch anything other than sweaters. Maybe, or anything that I'm not designing myself. And the only thing other than sweaters that I tend to design myself are cowls. And I used to do like fancier cowls with different stitches and that kind of thing, and I swatch for that. But lately I am just doing like much simpler seed stitch or stockinette in the round cowls, so that when I wear them with my hand knit sweaters, they don't overwhelm with different designs. So I don't swatch for that either. So I only would do a design swatch really for something other than a sweater. With socks, I'm almost always using someone else's pattern, and I just know what stitch count I like. I always use size 0 needles, except for colorwork socks. But I don't knit a lot of colorwork socks. And then with like the fingering weight hats, I've just been knitting them all on. I have an interchangeable set of size 0 to 3, but I also have a few fixed 16-inch circulars, and that's my preference versus the interchangeables, because the fixed ones are like the resin wood, whereas the interchangeables are metal. So since I have that in a 1.5 and a 3, I've just been knitting all the brims on 1.5s and all of the bodies on 3s. And it's worked out well. But yeah, so I don't swatch for anything other than sweaters. Or if I'm doing color work with a lot of different colors and I'm trying to figure out what color order I want to do it, and I do that with a swatch. But once again, that's design to me versus gauge swatch. Gauge swatches I really only do for sweaters, and otherwise I just assume I'm going to get a certain gauge, and it tends to work out. But I'm curious, what do you swatch for and what don't you swatch for? And then my other question I have for you is, what do you do with your swatches once you finished a project? I always save my swatch in case I need it to like win at Yarn Chicken, although I rarely have to unravel a swatch, but it's happened. So I make sure that, it's there for me if I need it. And then I don't really know what to do with them afterwards. I tried using a couple for coasters, but they were knit in a woolly yarn and they were just picking up cat fur like no one's business, which was not terribly appealing. And so right now I just kind of stuff them all in this chest. But I'm kind of thinking it might be time for a clear out and that I might just toss them. Would that be bad? I don't know. I'm really curious to hear what you do with your swatches once you're done with them, because especially something like this, it's so small. Unraveling this for the yarn would not really, there's not a lot of point there, unless, I need a little bit more for a bind off. But, so I don't know what to do with my swatches once I finish them. But when they're swatches for a project that I'm working on, then I keep them on this little clipboard that I have on my wall, and it's right there, which is why I looked that direction. And I will insert a picture here because I really like looking at it, and I like the texture that it adds to my walls. And I am planning to take up spinning next year. And in that case, I'm sure that I'll have my samples from my yarn up on my memo board too. But for now, it's swatches from whatever my current projects are. And I just added a stitch marker to this one because it's pretty, but it's a little heavy for most of the knitting that I do. So this way I get to look at it anyway. Finally, I just wanted to briefly address my name change. So I started this podcast or YouTube channel 5 years ago, and that's when I had chosen The Charm of It, which is based on an Anne Sexton poem called Just Once, and it's a poem that I really love, and it's still dear to my heart. But 5 years is a long time, and I've changed quite a bit as a person. I was 29, when I started, and now I'm 34. And for the past couple years, I haven't been that active, either here on YouTube or on Instagram, and so coming back to it, especially with regular activity, Sorry about the moth meowing. Anyway, it sort of feels like a renaissance, and it had me thinking a lot about what I wanted to do with my space and what my values were and how to support those values, which I talked a little bit about a couple episodes ago. But I also just feel like a name change kind of helps cement that. It also, so what I've done is the newer episodes that I just started recording, those will go by the Crafted Spoon, and then everything else will stay the charm of it. And that way it'll be easy for people to tell what was filmed with edited subtitles and what wasn't. Because I don't think that I'll ever have the spoons to go back and edit subtitles for 80-something episodes. But so that was kind of the impetus for the name change. And then I chose the name that I did. Spoons mean a lot to me because I have chronic illnesses, and people with chronic illnesses are also known as spoonies because of an essay that was written, years ago, in which a woman with chronic illnesses tries to explain her experience to an able-bodied friend at a diner and is using spoons. And I first became ill when I was 15, and now I'm 34. So that is 2/3 of my life, really. It's an important part of my identity. And I also love spoons because there's a lot of association with like creating soups and that kind of thing. And my tagline now is stirring my cauldron of knitting, reading, and inclusive coziness. And I thought that that would work really nicely with a username that used spoon in it. I'm sorry about my pets. And so then I opted for crafted because crafting is an important part of my life, and I want my identity on the internet to feel crafted, to feel intentional. For me, crafting is about sitting down and creating something intentionally, and I really love that. I also like that it's a little bit witchy, the craft and all that. And yeah, I really aspire to have a well-crafted life, both online and offline. So it's an aspirational name as well as one that speaks to my heart now. So that is a little bit about why I chose and swapped the name I did. You can read more over on Instagram if you are interested. And thank you so much for listening to another episode with me. If you want to keep up with me in between episodes, as I mentioned, I am over on Instagram. That is definitely where I'm most active. And in addition to posting in stories, things about my hand-knit outfits, the pets, what I'm reading, what I'm knitting, that kind of thing, I also do posts on my grid that are about knitting and reading, and those I aim to do resource posts as well as like silly reels for finished objects. So I've started posting some of my some of my favorite free patterns, not my free patterns, I'm not a designer, to make sure that knitting is economically accessible, and I plan to kind of expand my resource offerings as I go this year. It's one of the things I want to do to give back to the community. So in order to make that happen on Instagram, which is not very link friendly, I have also created a blog, or I already had a blog, but I have adapted it and freshened it up. And so you can also find links to free patterns that I am categorizing in like just groups of 3 based on my whimsy over at my blog, which is still thecharmofit.wordpress.com, but it's called The Crafted Spoon. And I'll include links to both that and my Instagram account down below. I also have a Ravelry account if Ravelry is still accessible to you, although I'm not terribly active over there. If you want a reply to comments, either here on YouTube or Instagram are your best bets. And I believe that's it. I used to have a Library Thing account, but I have recently closed that for reasons that I'll get into more next week, or at least I'm not updating that. So those are the 3 places you can find me in between episodes. I would love to hear from you. I so appreciate everyone who takes the time to comment or do the thumbs up button. And I'm really grateful that you are interested in hearing my thoughts on knitting. I hope that you have a really nice time until I see you again. And remember, with thanks to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Emma Lazarus, until we are all cozy, we are none of us cozy. Goodbye.